Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Learning Myths and Evidence-Based Training Methods webinar. Just one quick item to bring to everyone's attention. This webinar is informational only and is not eligible for continuing education credit or professional development hours. I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items with everyone. This webinar is currently being recorded. The recording and PowerPoint presentation will be provided to all registrants and attendees later in the week. So if you were not able to attend today, you have a coworker who has also registered, everyone will be provided that recording. If you are having technical difficulties at all, you can see the screen, but you can't hear me talking, or you can hear me talking, but you are not sure what you are looking at, you can use the chat or questions functionality to go ahead and let us know. The questions function and the chat function is there for your participation to ask questions or comment throughout the webinar. If we do not get to your question or comment right away, we will try to address that at the end. There will also be a couple polling questions throughout the webinar, and we will be asking for your participation. When a poll question is asked, you will be prompted to use the poll section to respond. There may be an open chat question, and if you need to participate, you can use, again, that questions chat function. And last but not least, there is a short survey at the end of this webinar that will allow you to opt in if you are interested to a short series of weekly emails with additional resources. If for any reason you're not prompted with the survey at the end of the webinar, it will also be sent out as an email for you to respond. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about who we are. Vector Solutions is our umbrella brand company, and underneath that is our commercial section. And my name is Casey. I'm working for the Red Vector portion, and Jeff, our presenter today, works for Convergence, and we provide online training solutions for the industrial manufacturing, the architecture, engineering, constructions, as well as the facilities management spaces. So that was a little bit about me, and without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Jeff, and he is going to introduce himself and get us started.
All right, great. Thank you, Casey. How are you today? Thank you very much for introducing us. And hi to everybody.
We can see your screen, so it looks good.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. And hi to everybody out there. Thanks for coming in. I see scroll through the list of names, a lot of names I'm not familiar with, so great to meet you all. And today we're going to be talking about evidence-based training methods and some learning myths. Just to highlight some of the things maybe Casey said, or maybe a couple additional bits of information. This is part of an ongoing webinar series Casey and I have been doing at the Red Vector site. So if you're interested, you can go back and listen to some recordings of previous ones. The last one we did was specific to effective safety training, and we had one on new safety, things like HOP, Safety Differently, and Safety 2 as well. So check those out at Red Vector. Casey already mentioned we're going to do our best to take questions at any time, so feel free to put those in, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. We'll try to get this done in about an hour. Sometimes it goes over. If you have to leave, that's fine. We'll get the recording to you. Casey mentioned there are 2 polls, so be ready for those. And she mentioned also there's a little survey at the end. Please do fill out that survey. We ask, how we did and what you'd like to talk about in the future. But also there's a chance for you to opt in to a series of follow-up emails. You'd get 1 a week for, I believe, for 6 weeks as additional information and resources about evidence-based training. Casey mentioned that we both work for different companies that are part of Vector Solutions. You're at Vector Solution, I'm sorry, Red Vector, listening to this webinar. A lot of the resources that I'll have available are from the Convergence training blog. To that point, I invite you after this webinar, if you want to connect on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook as well. Sign up for the Convergence newsletter if you're interested. Email me, my email is right there at the bottom of the screen. And then one final tip before we get started. I know this webinar is, in general, it's not intended just for safety training. I imagine there are some people in the safety sphere listening today. And I just want to give you a heads up, ANSI and ASSP just finalized the new standard Z490.2 for online environmental health and safety training. So if that's of interest to you, you can buy that at ANSI and ASSP. And with that, let's get going. So today we're going to talk about evidence-based training and explain what that means. To kind of ground our discussion, we'll talk about a model that explains how people process information, learn, and use that information on the job in 4 steps. We're going to talk about a distinction between training delivery methods and instructional methods. We'll highlight the effectiveness of blended learning approaches and explain what that means. We'll get into some discrete evidence-based training methods. I don't recall how many, 10 or 15 perhaps. Highlight a couple common learning myths, things that people might think lead to effective training, but in fact don't. And then we're going to give you a bunch of resources about where to learn more. There are a lot of really great learning researchers out there doing studies and meta studies and compiling data and analyzing it to come up with all the tips that I'm passing along today. So I really encourage you to check these people out at their websites, their blogs, their white papers, their books. And we're going to give you some of those names at the end of the day here. So your turn, Casey.
Oh, sorry. Could you tell us a little bit about what evidence-based training means? What does this mean to you?
Yeah, so this may or may not be obvious to people, but the idea of evidence-based training is just simply that you've got some kind of research and some kind of data showing that what you're doing is effective. You know, and this idea of being evidence-based is kind of common in our society. You know, we've listed on the screen just a few examples of different fields or practices where people attempt to use evidence-based methods. And you know, that first one there on the left, medicine, I think this is a pretty intuitive and obvious example. Most of us would want to go to a doctor or a nurse who practices evidence-based practices. You know, data shows this is effective. Yeah, please do that for me. Data shows this is not effective, or there's no data showing this is effective. That's probably not a doctor that I personally want to go to. And I think that's a commonly understood point, minus, of course, the controversy about vaccinations, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. But the same is true in training. You know, we should be doing the same thing. Instead of just going on hunches about what we think makes effective training, or maybe things that have actually been disproven, or maybe never even really bothering to have this thought, like what makes training effective. We should be looking at, you know, doing research, looking at research, piling over data, looking at studies and meta studies, and asking ourselves what really makes training effective. So when we're talking about evidence-based training, we're just talking about the use of this evidence-based practice and finding out what really works.
Sorry, I can't find my questions right now, Jeff, so if you just want to go ahead and take this one. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. So one of the things that's really helpful to ground this whole discussion about, we're going to go into some details about specific things that make, specific practices that make training more effective, and some practices that don't make training effective. But to kind of understand that, it really helps to understand how people learn. And this right here on the screen is a illustration of a really common model to explain how people process information, remember it, and then later use it on the job. So it's a simple 4-step process. It's not entirely linear, even though it's drawn out that way, and we'll call that out as we go on here. I'll talk us through it. So at any one moment, including right now, all of us are being bombarded by, you know, a cajillion, roughly, bits of sensory stimuli from the external world. And we have a part of our brain that we call the sensory memory that is effectively filtering almost all of that out. You know, we're choosing, it's an unconscious decision. It's not like you're consciously saying, I'm going to pay attention to this and not that. It's being done for you. but almost all the stimuli in the external world is being filtered out, and your brain's processing just the tiniest bit. And so that happens in just a fraction of a second, and most everything gets filtered out. That stuff that gets through sensory memory is then processed by what we call working memory. And by working memory, we're talking about the part of your brain that you're consciously aware of having thoughts on right now. It's the stuff you're thinking about right now. Ideally, you're looking at the screen and you're listening to my voice, but you might also be wondering about the ambient room temperature and that view out the window. But there's a limited number of things you can think about at any one time, and that's happening in working memory. You can also only keep those things in your working memory for a short period of time. So limited amount of items in working memory, by which we're talking about maybe 4. Limited amount of time you can keep information there before you just lose it, by which we're talking 15 to 30 seconds. And that's where long-term memory comes in. So at that same time, you get new information in working memory, and your working memory starts to actively kind of grind on that and think about this new information. The brain also activates, it kind of does a quick search of your brain and looks for any information that's related to that new information, so it can help to make sense of that new information. And that's why learning, one aspect of learning is sense making. And so it activates this existing knowledge that you have in long-term memory that's related to the new information. It uses that existing information to start making sense of that new information, and it begins to make neural connections, new neural connections to save parts of that new information and integrate it with the old information. So this is really a back and forth here in the middle of this process between working memory and long-term memory. But the idea is you're taking new information and you're integrating it into existing information to make a little packet of related information, and you strengthen that over time. The more times you come back to it, the more information you apply to it and integrate it, and so on. So ultimately, you get information in long-term memory, but that in itself is not a guarantee that you'll use that information at the appropriate time later on the job. And that's what's called transfer. So that's the process as a training developer, an instructional designer, a learning professional, whatever, however you think of yourself. That's the process you're trying to facilitate when you're designing, developing, and delivering training. And it's also, I guess, the flip side of the coin. It's the process you're trying not to break at the same time. We're going to give you some tips for how to facilitate this process, and we're going to give you some tips of things to steer away because it breaks this process.
Okay, great. So I've heard discussions in which people have debated which form of training, whether it be classroom, e-learning, etc., is the most effective. How does that all fit into this discussion?
Yeah, so that's an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up. So I'm referring to that as training delivery methods or training delivery media. I think that's how you most commonly see these, or modes. That's how you most commonly see people in L&D refer to this issue. And we're talking about things like instructor-led classroom training, or field-based hands-on training, or e-learning, or written materials, or kind of newer stuff like virtual reality or augmented reality. And the let's go, before we answer the question, let's go into a poll.
Okay, great. So we want to hear from you. We want to know which training delivery method do you think is most effective? The poll question is now open. We want to know, do you think it's written, classroom, field-based, e-learning, virtual reality, or other? So this poll is now open for you to answer, and we're welcoming any chat comments that you have if you choose other.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to vote, but we're welcome. If you got something you want to chime in on in the chat, go right ahead.
We're collecting responses now, so they're coming in.
I can see the percentages. They're pretty interesting.
Yeah, a lot of you are saying field-based. Got field-based, we've got a little bit of classroom, some virtual reality. I have a couple comments. I'm not sure if you're seeing these too, Jeff. They really are all effective, but it depends on the learner, which I know we're going to get into that more.
Yeah, I don't see that comment actually, so thanks for sharing that with me. And we will definitely address that issue. There are really two issues. Depends on the learner, in that comment, depends on the learner, and they're all effective.
Right, I'm going to give it, okay, we've got another comment that says it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Usually a combination of methods is helpful.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, but we're ending on 74% saying field-based, 19% virtual reality, and 7% classroom.
Also with 0% written and 0% e-learning. So that's all really interesting. Obviously a heavy emphasis toward field-based training. We did have a couple comments, one about they can all be effective, depends on what you're trying to do. Good stuff, everybody, thank you. All right, so let's go to what the studies show us. And there's a classic book, I'll refer to this a couple times in this webinar, by a woman named Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark. The book is called Evidence-Based Training Methods. We'll be sure to get you a link to that in the follow-up email campaign we talked about if you guys opt into that. But go ahead and read the text on screen to yourself, highlight it in red there. And what you can see is Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark here is showing, who's done studies and meta-studies on this kind of thing, is saying that evidence from hundreds of media comparison studies show that learning effectiveness does not depend on the delivery medium. So for those of us who said field-based is best or virtual reality is best, that's actually not what the studies reflect. And for those who say they can all be effective, I think you're pointed in the right direction. Now, you might notice as well, Dr. Clark, let me go back to that, I apologize. She said, but training effectiveness rather reflects the best use of basic instructional methods. So she's making a distinction here between training delivery methods and instructional methods. And let's talk about these instructional methods, because this is what she's saying studies show really creates effective training or doesn't, the use of these or not using these. So instructional methods are the things you actually do or have the learners do during training. And this includes things like practice, feedback, visuals, testing, repetition, some things called chunking and sequencing that we talk about in instructional design, and so on. So, you know, the training delivery method itself has no effect or no determination on whether or not your training is going to be effective. What's important are the instructional methods that you use during the training, like the ones we're calling out here. And these are the ones we're going to talk about more a little bit later in the webinar. So for an analogy, and using analogies, by the way, is another evidence-based training method. Analogy is if you look at think about a chocolate chip cookie, which is one of my favorite cookies. The delivery method can be thought of as the dough. It's the way to get the chocolate chip to you. So the delivery method, at least in my life, the whole reason to have a chocolate chip cookie is to have the chocolate chips. So in our analogy here, the delivery method is the cookie dough, and the instructional method, the stuff that really brings you the bang for the buck, the stuff that's delicious, the stuff that gives you effective training, is the chocolate chip or the instructional method. So the delivery method itself doesn't really matter, but obviously what you want to do is you want to choose the best delivery method that allows you to embed the necessary instructional methods that will lead to effective training.
So if I'm right, there may be one exception to what you just said about delivery training methods, and it has to do with blended learning. Can you tell us what blended learning is and go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, you betcha, Casey. And I guess one of the commenters kind of hinted at this too. I can't remember exactly what that person said, but he or she talked about using a combination. And that's basically what we mean when we talk about blended learning. Originally, when people talked about blended learning, it was specifically about using online courses and classroom instruction. A lot of times, the recommendation was to use something called the flipped model, where you do online to deliver content, and then you follow that up with classroom to either do practice or demonstrations or answer questions or stuff that's necessary for people to work on together. But basically, you can think of blended learning solutions as any mix and match of training delivery types. So, you know, it could be field-based training with virtual reality, for example. And going back to Dr. Ruth Colden Clark's book and her studies, she says that evidence suggests that blended learning environments are more effective than using purely classroom training or pure digital. So, you know, I guess your takeaway here is you should be using blended delivery methods. You shouldn't be a one-trick pony and doing all instructor-led training or all online, or maybe in the future, all virtual reality. And Dr. Clark's work here is backed up by another study by the U.S. Department of Education. Again, check out the red highlighted text. Blended elements of online and face-to-face instruction with conditions taught entirely face-to-face. Larger in these studies. So better learning improvement with blended learning. And then another learning researcher who I really recommend you check out as well, Dr. Will Thalheimer. His white paper on the exact same issue found the exact same thing. Blended learning using both online learning and classroom instruction creates the largest benefits. So if you've got one takeaway there and maybe one exception to the delivery method issue, blended learning is the most effective. And I'm just cheating there because obviously we're still not prioritizing one delivery method over the other. Why is that? That blended learning is more effective than others? I've never seen it answered. I don't know the answer myself. I have a guess, which I've taken from some other people, and I think it's simply the fact that you're increasing, you're getting repetition and you're increasing variability, both which we'll talk about a little bit later.
So beyond the value of using blended learning, can you walk us through some specific evidence-based practices for creating more effective training?
Yeah, you betcha, Casey. And I think we might be coming up for another little survey here. Yeah, so let's talk about this issue of learning styles right now. And Casey, am I right? Do we have a little poll question set up for us here?
We do have a poll question. Do you want me to ask it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So our next poll. Oh, where did it
While
go?
Casey's firing us up, in case anybody isn't familiar, learning styles is this kind of common idea that we have people have different learning styles, often expressed as kinesthetic, visual, or auditory, or KVA, meaning learning by seeing, learning by doing, learning by hearing. So that's our setup for this poll.
Okay. So does designing training to match learning styles, KVA, that Jeff just mentioned, lead to more effective training? That poll has now been launched, and do you think yes, it does lead to more effective training, matching those learning styles, or no? And if you have any other comments, you can use those chat functions or the question functions.
I see folks are voting. Feel free, if you got a comment, to use the chat or question. I don't seem to be able to see them, but I know Casey can, so Casey can relay.
Yeah, it says we had a couple of people say, I'm guessing training that hits on all three is the best type. Another one that says depends on the learning goals. That actually might be from the last poll. But right now, 70% are saying yes.
All right, interesting comments.
Fluctuating a little.
Fluctuating a little. Interesting comments. The person who said something that touches on all these aspects, and that's a great point. And then learning goal is important to keep in mind as well. How are we doing on our percentages? Are we about wrapped up, Casey?
We're at 67% yes and 33% no. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll for now.
All right.
And we had another comment that says depends on the topic.
On the topic as well. Yeah. So we talked a couple things about the learning need, I guess. So the topic's clearly part of that learning need. So learning styles, I think, is probably one of the most commonly known theories about how to train people and how to make effective training. I would imagine most people on this webinar were familiar with the idea of learning styles, and maybe you couldn't remember the KVA initials, or you couldn't remember that big word kinesthetic. I have to write it down myself, but you knew the basic idea, I bet most of you. And it's also commonly accepted to be true. And a lot of learning professionals believe this is true. When I started my career a long time ago, I believed it's true because smart people who've been in the field for a long time said it was true. If you go off and Google it today, you will see a lot of people saying it's true. But the fact of the matter is, the data doesn't back it up. In fact, the data disproves it. So here's a couple of, again, I'm going to let you guys read the red highlighted text here. I'll be quiet. So, this is just one source, although it's a meta study as well, reviewing a whole bunch of sources. But the idea of learning styles has been pretty widely debunked by learning researchers and learning professionals. That doesn't mean that a lot of folks don't believe it. If you believe it, it's okay. I believed it too. A lot of folks do. But there's really currently no evidence that designing training in an attempt to match the learning styles of your workers leads to more effective training. And the studies I've shown that address it directly actually show the opposite, that trying to do so leads to less effective training. So, feel free to ping me. Again, if you follow up on that, if you sign up for those follow-up emails, we'll send you some additional information about this. But you can feel free to email me and we can talk more about some of the problems with learning styles, like how do you even know what somebody's learning style is, for example? And what happens when companies start creating proprietary methods to assess learning styles of individuals? And in the same way that we make companies have bogus tests for like personality types like Myers-Briggs, which again has no evidence backing it up. But anyway, so I would encourage you to steer away from trying to design training to accommodate learning styles, since there's no evidence it's actually effective. Which leads us to the next tips I'm going to give you, a series of tips here. What actually is effective? And one of the things that's most effective, and we've kind of talked about learning needs and the needs of your learners. One of the things you should be doing when you're designing training is finding out what the current level of knowledge or expertise is by your training population on the topic that you plan to train them on. And a huge distinction that you can make and that's useful when you're designing that training and delivering that training is to figure out who's a novice on that topic and who's an expert. So obviously, a couple of distinctions here. You need to provide different kinds of information to novices than you do to experts. Namely, you can probably leave a lot of the foundational or basic information out of the training for experts and maybe give them some advanced topics. But in addition to that, novices and experts learn differently. There's quite a bit of research on this, quite a bit of literature, and quite a bit of difference between these two training populations. But a couple issues to call out. Novices and experts both have the same working memory bottleneck. They can each only deal with maybe 4 bits of information at any one time. However, novices, those bits that novices can process on a topic that's relatively new to them are much smaller than the bits that experts can process. So you can still give more information to an expert as long as it's kind of organized into logical bits or chunks. And we'll get to this idea of chunking shortly. And you really have to keep those bits small for novices. So that's one. Another one is you hear a lot about inquiry-based learning, which is kind of putting a problem in front of a learner and letting him or her try to solve that problem and having that be the learning activity. And that can be very helpful, but only for experts. Experts can really benefit from that kind of training, and novices don't. Novices need much more hand-holding and much more of a linear process of working them through content and practice and so on. So that's an example. Another example is visuals. Novices really benefit from simplified visuals, whereas experts can handle more kind of complicated, rich visuals. So there's a lot of difference between novice and experts. a lot of ways you should design training that's different for them, but there's 4 right there. Another thing, and hopefully you guys are all doing this out there, is simply writing and creating learning objectives. I'm sure some of you already know what a learning objective is. Hopefully all of you do, but in case some don't, learning objective is something as a training designer, you should sit down before you create any training and ask yourself, what am I trying to get my learners to be able to do when training's over? And that's your learning objective in short. And once you have a learning objective, you then create training content to teach people how to satisfy that learning objective, how to perform it. And then you have a test, perhaps, which is a good idea, I think, to assess the person's performance and their ability to perform that learning objective. And again, studies show that learning objectives actually lead to more effective training for a variety of reasons. You're going to design better training, but it also signals when you tell the learner what the learning objective is, it signals them what they need to pay attention to, and they can start self-assessing their understanding during training. Another topic is this idea of chunking and sequencing, and this fits into this idea of we have limited amount of information we can process in our working memory at any one time. So the idea is that you've got some kind of large group of information that you want to cover in training, and you want to break that down into small bits or chunks. And then you want to organize those chunks in a logical sequence. And you can, and maybe this image, which is something I designed, doesn't illustrate this next point as well. You can kind of present that information to the learners in advance in kind of like an outline form. So they can see the chunks, and they can even see like the related sub-chunks, and they can understand the sequence that you're going to go through training and how all these things are related. And so it's really helpful to break things down into chunks and sub-chunks, to sequence that information in a logical flow or order, and also to present that sequence or those chunks to learners in advance in what's called it's often called a visual organizer. So if you can kind of show people the bird's eye view of what you're going to be talking about, it helps them start to kind of process that information, call up related information, and start organizing this new information. Again, to that point, we talked about how working memory and long-term memory work together during that 4-stage process. So at the beginning of training, it's really a good idea to get people thinking about stuff that they already know that's related to your training topic. And that's what we mean by awakening prior knowledge. So in a safety world, for example, if you're going to talk, if it's 2012, if we're going back in time, and you're going to talk about the alignment of the HAZCOM standard with the GHS, you would kind of want to start talking about HAZCOM and get people pulling up and awakening that information. And then when you give them new information, it's going to be easier for them to integrate that new information with that existing prior information. This is also something that's discussed for those of you who might be familiar in Robert Gagne's 9 events of instruction. So it's out there in a common learning theory, but it's also backed up with data. Using conversational and informal language. So you really want to, sometimes people, I find, when they go into training, they use really academic or unnecessarily formal language. And you really want to try to mirror the conversational language of your training population as much as possible, which obviously means you need to know your training population. You need to know how they speak. Now, caution: you're not trying to do this in an exaggerated caricature manner. You know, if you're 53 like me and you're trying to train some millennials, you don't want to go in and try to be a hipster who's using all the latest text message slang. That's not my point. But you do want to just be conversational and formal. A couple tips: just use shorter sentences, use smaller words. And then a little pro tip here for you. Studies show that if you use the word you, Y-O-U, second person, you refer to your training population using the word you, that leads to more effective training. I think it's often easy for people to kind of not talk to, directly address the learners. And maybe this is especially true in e-learning as opposed to face-to-face training. But you shouldn't be talking exclusively about a work process or exclusively about a procedure or exclusively about equipment or a machine. you should be talking to the learners about how they will perform that work process or how they can operate that machine. So use the second person when possible. I guess another tip for that, if you want to keep your sentences short and everything, use the active voice, don't use the passive voice. Related to this issue of language is storytelling. Study after study after study shows that if you use stories during training, you'll end up with more effective training. And there's a couple reasons for that. Basically, humans are hardwired to pay attention to and remember stories. So if you tell a story during training, you're more likely to get people's attention. Nobody's going to learn if they're not paying attention. So stories are great for getting attention. People are more likely to remember things that they learn from stories than they were just straight, facts and data. So that's another benefit. You're not getting not just attention, but you're getting increased memory. And then training is all about changing behavior. It's all about changing performances after training. And hopefully everybody out there already buys into that. So stories are great about motivating people to make behavior changes, motivating people to go out and apply what we just learned in training on the job. So stories increase attention, increase memory or retention, and increase the motivation to go do it. So it's pretty hard to argue against the benefits of storytelling in training. Visuals. Somebody I think mentioned it, I think this is related. Somebody said you should use all that KVA stuff, and I agree. And in the same way, you should, in training, you should always try to apply to as many senses as possible when it's appropriate. I'll give you an example. A lot of times in safety training, they'll tell people these are the alarms you might hear at this facility in an emergency. It would be great, obviously, to include the sound of those alarms. Likewise, if you go to a paper mill, for example, and someone's telling you about hydrogen sulfide, I don't know how to do this, but it would be great if you could actually smell hydrogen sulfide, because that's one of the indicators that there's a disaster, is that you can smell the rotten egg smell of hydrogen sulfide before it disappears. So maybe I'm making a call here for scratch and sniff cards during training. But if you have to focus on just appealing to one sense, visuals give you the greatest bang for the buck. We evolved on the African savanna, I suppose. It was really important for us to be able to look across the savanna and recognize a lion or a leopard. And we have devoted a ton of processing power in our brain to processing visuals. So visuals really make training more effective. They don't have to be super cool 3D animations like what we're seeing here. If you can get up on a whiteboard and scribble a little stick figure, that could be exceptionally valuable as well. But try to incorporate related visuals that illustrate the points you're trying to make during training. Keep it short. Again, people can only process a limited amount of information. They can only do it for a limited amount of time. There's no magic number to how many minutes your training should be. But yeah, you just want to keep it as short as possible. And to that point, you want to cover less. And that's one great way to keep it short. Once you've created your learning objectives and created training content to match those objectives, go back to that content before you deliver it and ask yourself, is there something here I can take out, which we're kind of trying to illustrate on this screen? What can I remove from this training? In training, less is always more. So resist those urges to keep all that information in. Resist any urge to add bonus content because you think it's really interesting. It probably is interesting, but it's going to distract people from what they're supposed to learn and do on the job. I can go home tonight and I can listen to the Discovery Channel if I just want to see something interesting. And I promise it'll be interesting and I will have forgotten it by tomorrow morning. But in training, remember, less is more, and keep it down to the bare minimum to teach people what they need to do on the job. Examples are a great way to train. If you can give examples of this is how to do this and not that. So it might be a procedure. I want you to do it this way, not that way. It might be just a visual example. This is a house cat. This is a line, for example, or this is a piece of equipment, and that's not the same piece of equipment. It could also be a kind of a work example where you're showing people how to do things. But examples, a lot of data showing these are effective. And kind of at the heart of effective training are the next couple screens here. The first is giving learners the opportunity to perform realistic practice of the skill you're trying to teach them on the job. So you want to make this as real as possible and make it match what they're supposed to do on the job as much as possible. And while you're giving them that opportunity for realistic practice, you want to give them constructive feedback on their performance. That's true during training, and really you should be thinking about that after training as well. Because ideally, training doesn't, or learning and development efforts don't end when the training session's over, and you'll be continuing this kind of constructive feedback over time. But that combination of practice and constructive feedback is a learning accelerator. And if you want to learn more about that, I really recommend you look into a book by a guy named Anders Ericsson. The book is called Peak: The Science of Expertise, and his theory about deliberate practice, because it's not just doing something over and over and over again. It's identifying something you're weak on and then practicing on that and getting feedback on that. And an expert can help you identify what you're weak on and tell you, guide your practice through those weak points. Testing, we already talked about testing when we were talking about learning objectives and assessing your learner's ability to satisfy that objective. Testing is really important for a lot of reasons. You might just think, oh, I just want to make sure people know how to do this. And that's true. It's a valid reason. In compliance training, it might just be a check the box kind of thing. And that's unfortunate, but true as well. But we get you. We know you have to do that sometimes. But testing also has a benefit for learning, which is a great way to do it. So actually having be tested either in a low stakes practice situation or maybe an environment where the stakes are a little bit higher actually does have a learning benefit. So testing is more than just a check the box exercise. Then the next couple ideas go together as well. And this is, again, another really important thing for learning. If you are doing just kind of one and done training, you're kind of dooming yourself to have training that's less effective than it could be. Humans, are just kind of hardwired again to forget information over time to a certain degree. And so if you're doing one and done training, people are just going to end up forgetting that pretty quickly. And that's one of the reasons I want you guys, I hope some of you sign up for this email campaign, because I expect most of you to forget almost everything I said today by next week as well. And so I want to keep sending you reminders about this kind of stuff. And that you should be doing the same with your learners. Give them an opportunity to come back to that content over and over again over time. And that's what we call spaced practice or spaced learning. Now you can do that within a single learning activity where you taught them something in the morning and then you come back in the afternoon and review it or have them practice it again. And then later in the day, they do it again. Or maybe it'll be the initial training plus some space practice tomorrow and some space practice a week later and some space practice a month later and so on. And there's a lot of rich data, literature about space practice and how to time those intervals out. It's kind of a good idea over time to allow enough time that people have literally started to forget, because when they start to forget and then they have to retrieve that information, it makes them work harder and it strengthens the eventual neural connections. And that segues into this last point I want to make, which is about retrieval. When you want people to learn something or to remember something, instead of just asking, exposing them to the information again, so it's a passive experience, or even asking them to recognize something, ask them to dig deep and pull the information out of their brains themselves or apply that information on their own. And that's what we're talking about retrieval here. So if you use retrieval as part of your spaced practice, you'll end up with a lot more learning benefits. Going back to that 4-step model, just a few ideas of how some of these things can apply from top to bottom. The first phase was sensory memory. If you reduce distractions during training and you add visual cues telling people what to pay attention to in the sense of arrows, pointers, and highlights, you could get more effective training. Working memory, if you chunk your content and you sequence it and use those visual organizers we're talking about, it's easier to process in working memory. Long-term memory, if you awaken that prior knowledge before training starts, the stuff people already know that's related to the new topic. If you give people the opportunities for practice and feedback, better chance you're going to make a strong connection in long-term memory. And then for retrieval and transfer, that 4-step, using it on the job, if you provide training with workplace cues, meaning you're training in the actual work environment or with these same tools or something like that, for using spaced practice and spaced learning and retrieval practice. All of these will facilitate those the 4 different steps of the human processing model that we showed you earlier.
Okay, Jeff, so if those are some evidence-based training practices, can you tell us about the flip side of the coin and walk us through some learning myths?
Yeah, so obviously we already covered learning styles, and that's arguably the biggest. I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of these, but I want to just expose you guys to some, and then again, we'll have more information in a follow-up email campaign, and the learning researchers who I refer you to, and we'll give you their names in this PowerPoint. You can get the PowerPoint in Casey's email next week. They'll tell you all about these things as well. But here's a little laundry list. First of all, this idea that telling somebody something is the same as training. Now, I don't think you'll see too many people stand up and actually make this point, but you will see, I've seen this, after a training has occurred, you will see whoever delivered the training sometimes in a frustrated manner say, I don't understand why they get it. I told them this. And you did tell them this, but telling is not training. Telling is a passive way to expose people to information. And if you're not using the evidence-based methods we're talking about, yeah, people are going to forget it, and you can be guaranteed of that. So remember that telling is not the same thing as training. Sometimes you hear, and I think maybe sometimes this comes from corporate offices, I'm not certain, that training cannot include humor. That's also not true. Humor creates emotions. When we experience emotions, we tend to remember things more effectively. Also, humor is fun sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of fun. It keeps people paying attention during training. Now, so feel free to use humor sometimes, but remember, of course, your job is to teach people information and skills. Your job is not to go up there and be a clown. So you don't want to totally distract them. You could be the funniest man or woman in front of the training room, and people can have a great time, and they can give you a great evaluation saying this is really fun, but they're not going to learn anything. So don't be a clown, but also don't be offensive. That's probably obvious enough. Don't be crude and vulgar, but it's worth remembering. And it's always in good taste to make fun of yourself as opposed to making fun of your learners. Never make fun of learners, because people learn better in a supportive environment. Always feel free to poke fun at yourself. Rich media always improves training. Rich media, what I mean is super complicated multimedia of any sort. Mixing and matching all these different medias, having lots of bells and whistles and flash, that rich media can create really effective training when used at appropriate moments. It can also detract from training very easily as well. So, if you're a training developer and you don't have the tools and the horsepower to create like the most impressive rich media for your training, it's okay. Do what you can, and a lot of times what you're doing is as effective or not as effective, or equally effective, or more effective, I'm sorry. So don't assume that rich media is always the best. It has a place for sure. Now, millennials are from Mars. Millennials, they're not like us, or at least not like old men like me. They don't get it. I don't know how to get things through to them. They learn differently. There are no studies showing that there's a massive monolith of people named millennials, all of whom think the same way. In fact, studies show there's almost no correlation between the decisions or the opinions that people who we identify as millennials, the opinions they have. There's no they don't have the same opinions in block. Studies show that. So yes, you might think, oh, millennials are different, but frankly, I think this is just a human thing where we always think that the younger generation is different than us. You can look back in time, at, punk rock kids and hippie kids, and I bet back in the jazz age, flapper kids. People were probably always complaining about this next generation coming into the workforce. And so I would encourage you, don't think of millennials as different or as unreachable, and don't think of them as millennials. Find out who they really are, like Sue and Jim and John, and find out what makes those people tick and what their learning needs are. I guess another thing to call out, yes, these people, millennials did grow up in an area where they're used to the internet and they're used to mobile phones. And they would expect training to be delivered on the internet and phones in some cases. But at this point, I don't think that's even all that unique for anybody else as well. We all do most of our stuff on a lot of stuff on the internet and phones, and I think that's common throughout the population at this point. There was a Microsoft study showing that the human attention span has now been reduced to only 7 seconds. The headline suggested that that's now shorter than the attention span of a goldfish. And that study's been widely debunked as well. The theory was, because people can't pay attention for more than 7 seconds, which again is not true, then we have to deliver training in the world's tiniest bursts, which again is not true. So if you want a little debunker on this one, just think about binge watching TV shows like Game of Thrones or whatever your favorite Netflix show is, and think about how people spend hours and hours on a weekend watching multiple seasons of Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad. And clearly people can pay attention for an extended amount of time. Related to this is this idea there's a modern learner who learns differently. Again, the brain evolved over a long, long period of time. And the fact that the internet and computers and phones have been around for the last 20, 30 years or whatever it's been has not changed our brain evolution. It's true that there's new tools and we should try to use those tools when it facilitates learning or performance, workplace performance. And it's true there are additional distractions, but that doesn't mean our brain has changed. Microlearning is a silver bullet for all training needs. This is kind of related to this human attention span 7-second thing. For those of you who are not familiar with microlearning, it's really nothing new, although it's a new term. Really, at root, it just means a short burst of training or a short learning burst. Typically these days, it's used to talk about teaching somebody a short learning activity for about a minute or 5 minutes, usually focused on one learning objective. And oftentimes it's talked about in the context of delivering it via mobile device. I'm a big fan of microlearning, although again, it's really nothing new, except for the mobile device aspect of it. It can be really effective. I think it's great for that space practice we talked about. But I would discourage anybody from saying, I'm going to completely change my training program and make it 100% microlearning. And that's a fool's errand. This last one is, all these things are up for debate. Everything I'm telling you about, we can find data tomorrow that shows something's not true. I have, all my research has shown me that a lot of times people tell you like, neuroscience is showing us, these new training methods, or brain science, sometimes you hear, is showing us how to train people. And I've never seen any research to suggest that's true. I just had a discussion with some neuroscientists on LinkedIn this week where they were saying it was true. And I was asking them to explain that to me. And to be totally honest, I feel like we were talking past one another. And what they did do was show me a couple points where neuroscience seems to have confirmed things that were already some of the things I already talked about already. So I don't think that's neuroscience or brain science telling us anything new. It is interesting that it seems to confirm. And I guess the jury's still out on this one. I'll say I think neuroscience is fascinating. I think we can learn a lot from it and probably will over time. So this one's open for debate as of last week. And then in L&D, there's a couple kind of models, one called Dale's Cone of Learning, one called 70-20-10. If you're not familiar with Dale's Cone of Learning by name, you might have seen it. It's usually a triangle with multiple colors from top to bottom, creating levels, suggesting that people remember 10% of what they hear and 20% of what they see and 90% of what they do or something like that. And I don't argue the basic idea, which is that people learn more if they do something, if we get down to the bottom of the triangle. But I do argue the exact ratios. And if you look back in the history of Dale's Cone of Learning, the data is bogus. There's no foundation for it. And I think it's a great cautionary tale, because whenever you're being told, here's an evidence-based training method, and here's the evidence, and all the numbers are 10%, or 10 or 20, 30%, your radar should be on immediately, suggesting maybe this isn't good data. And the same point is true with 70-20-10. 70-20-10 is a theory that people learn 70% of what they learn at work just through experience, 20% from engaging with coworkers, social learning, talking, and only 10% from formal learning. And there's a really powerful message behind 7-20-10, which is that as L&D professionals, we should put a lot of effort into helping people learn from experience and helping people learn socially, the 70 and the 20, and maybe not focus so exclusively on the 10. It's kind of like having a tail wag the dog. But again, the exact ratios are bogus. So it's good to be a critical consumer of this kind of information.
So in addition to these specific evidence-based training practices, you've talked with me about a useful framework people can use to kind of put this all together, and it's called the Decisive Dozen. Can you tell us more about this, Jeff?
Yeah, so there's a guy out there, a learning researcher named Dr. Will Thalheimer. I can't recommend him strongly enough, along with some others I'll mention soon. But he has this really useful model called the Decisive Dozen. Again, it's for some of you, if you're familiar with Robert Gagne's 9 events, it's kind of a similar idea. I encourage you guys all to go out on the webinar, download his PDF on this, watch his video on this. But here's the quick overview, and the learning he calls these 12 learning factors that create effective training, and they're listed here on the left. And I'll go over these quickly. But I think that, if you had training that included each of these dozen points, you would be doing excellently. And you can incorporate the evidence-based training methods I mentioned into these different points. So, have accurate content, expose people to that content when they need it, guide their attention to the important parts, work with them to create correct conceptions when they're integrating, making sense of that new information and integrating it with old information, filling gaps in their old information, correcting mistakes in that old information, repeat that practice opportunity, give feedback, give variation. Remember, we talked about this with blended learning. So deliver training from different mediums from different perspectives and have them solve a problem in different ways. Context alignment, make sure that people are getting training in a context that's similar to what they'll do on a real job. Spaced practice. Persuasion, well, why should I pay attention to this? Why should I go out and do it later? And then perseverance, support them after training. Remember, the training doesn't end when the class is over or when the e-learning course ends. Get out there and support them during learning and after learning. And maybe some of that means you're going to create a job aid that they can refer to outside of training as well. So I think this is a fantastic framework. And if all trainers use something like this, we'd all be doing a lot better at our jobs.
And where can people learn more about this on their own?
All right, so I've mentioned quite a few names already. 4 books to start with. The classic is Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark's Evidence-Based Training Methods. I recommend that. One of the greatest books, I think, about how people learn and how to design training is Julie Dirksen, Design for How People Learn. Super smart, super accessible. It'll make you feel good because she uses little hand-drawn stick characters. Great illustrations, but they're not fancy. This is great. Make sure to get the second volume. I would say if you just one book, start with this one. This Make It Stick book by Brown, Roediger, and McDaniel. Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, has some great evidence-based stuff, including something we didn't touch on too much today, by name at least, that's called desirable difficulties. And again, if you want people their brain to have to grind in order to really learn something, that's the basic idea of what a desirable difficulty is. We mentioned it when we talked about spaced practice and letting people start forgetting something before they have to retrieve it again. That's a desirable difficulty. Anyway, that's covered in this book, Make It Stick. And then really 3 books by another learning researcher, Dr. Patty Shank. I called out one here, Write and Organize for Deeper Learning, but she has another one for managing memory and another one for practice and feedback. Those books are excellent as well. And I guess a quick heads up, we will be interviewing her at the Convergence Training blog 3 times soon, 1 for each book. Here's maybe 10 or 20 good sources. Classic for multimedia is Richard Mayer. We already talked about Clark and Thalheimer and Shank. Clark Quinn's book, I'll call out. It's called something like Learning Misconceptions, Goldfish, and something else. Anyway, Dr. Clark Quinn, that book is good, and he debunks or talks about different learning theories. but he also has a great section on how to be a critical evaluator of learning data. And that's something we're not all good at in general. So I think that's a really powerful thing from that book. Let's see, Clark, Moore, Malamed, all great stuff. Julie Dirksen, I already mentioned. Anders Ericsson, this is the guy who wrote that book, Peak, about developing expertise, and a lot others. So, oh, and I guess lastly, go to the internet and check out something called the Debunkers Club, and they are constantly debunking learning myths. Lastly, a couple, if you're into the pop bestsellers, Daniel Pink's book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Remember, motivation is important because we're trying to create behavior change. So that book is data-based and really good. And he says, people need autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And then the Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, who are Stanford professors, have a good book, Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die, where they talk about what makes people remember things and what motivates people to go out and do things. Again, obviously related to training. What I'd like you all to do before you get into the next part of your workday is ask yourself, what can I begin doing tomorrow differently? What's like one thing that was discussed that I can do differently, and how am I going to do that? And then write a second note. What's my plan for learning more about this? Am I going to sign up for the follow-up emails with Jeff? Am I going to go out and buy some of these books? You know, just write down one thing you're going to do to learn more. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and open this up. So if you want to go ahead and use the question panel to ask some questions. We had a couple comments earlier in just regards to using evidence-based training. Drew said that was a good point about the reliability of evaluating a learner's style. We all probably flow in and out of each of the styles. And then somebody else said,
if I can speak to that, I think one of the problems with learning styles, the whole theory, which is similar to the problem with this idea that millennials are from Mars, is it separates people into different buckets and essentially divides us. And I think it's true that every human has their own different little realities and their own different learning needs, their own schedules, some of their own preferences. And we need to try to work with those as much as we can. But instead of dividing people into these like buckets, which are often misleading, I think we get more bang for our buck if we think about what people have in common. Like we all learn in that 4-step information processing model that I described. And if you focus on that, and if you focus on what data shows that makes most people learn, you'll do a lot better than arbitrarily and probably falsely separating people into different buckets.
Okay, still waiting on some more questions to come in.
So I'm now seeing the questions.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yeah. Eric missed the first 10 minutes. Eric, not to worry. Casey's going to send you an email and you can listen to a recording. And if you want to sign up for the follow-up email campaign that I've talked about, where you get one additional email a week over, I think, 6 weeks, as soon as you try to close down this webinar, you'll get a 4-question survey. And that's one of the questions you can say yes or no. And in addition, tell me if I'm right or wrong here, Casey. Casey's email that'll come out next week that has the recording and a PowerPoint will give you the option to sign up as well. Is that true, Casey?
That is correct.
All right, cool. And I see Drew Douglas got a question for me. He says, this is a little beyond the scope of this webinar, but he's asking anyway. I like it. Be bold, Drew. If a firm offers multiple training products, how important is a style guide to create cohesiveness in their offerings? So that's a big question, but I can address that at least at a superficial summary level. If you have a random kind of hodgepodge visual style, because you're not following a style guide, for example, Drew, that's obviously going to be something, if you think about your learner, they're going to notice it, right? They're going to get all this kind of random hodgepodge style. Maybe even though the e-learning courses are going to work differently. The next button won't be in the same place as it was last time. or things just looked, it's got a different, you know, frame around it, or it's a totally different visual style. And that's the kind of thing that can create distractions. And that if I've got 4 bits of information I can process in my working memory, and I'm trying to figure out where the next button is, I'm down to 3. So yeah, there is value in having a style guide, and there is value in being consistent. Now that doesn't mean you can't take learning from different learning providers and mix and match those. You can, but there is a value to consistency for sure. I hope that helped, Drew. Eric Foreman, you're fantastic. Thank you so much. Glad you liked it. And Trevor Walper. Trevor is wondering if there are any good rules for how you may train a group of both. Yeah, he's saying what happens, because the reality is I have to mix and match novices and experts. And which is a great question and a reality. I get you, Trevor. So, what I would suggest is incorporate those experts to help train the novices. They're going to have a ton of useful experience. They're in many cases they're going to know the stuff better than you or better than me anyway. So that would be my first bit of advice for you, is to involve those experts in helping to train off the novices. Any other questions?
I've not seen any other questions come through. Oh, one more, couple more.
I see Eric Foreman. Expanding on training format, red vector content is delivered in 5 to 6 different formats. Are there any plans to standardize? I believe there is, but Casey, you may have a better answer for this.
There are plans, yes. I would highly recommend you reaching out to your client services manager, your account manager. They are going to have updates on our training formats and some new kind of courses, new kind of series that we have coming out.
All right, so I hope that helps, Eric. Anybody else before we wrap this up? All right, well, I'll leave the last words for Casey, but I want to thank Casey for helping out with this. I want to thank everybody for attending. Remember that survey will give you the option to say, yes, please send me some follow-up emails. I also invite you guys all, feel free to ping me with an email. You see my email address here. I love questions. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, or follow our separate companies, Red Vector and Convergence, at Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well. And feel free to stop by the Convergence Training blog and sign up for our newsletter. With that, I thank you a bunch for your attention and for stopping in. And let us know if there's other webinars we can do in the future for you. Otherwise, watch out for the next one. Casey?
All right, thanks everybody. Yep, as Jeff mentioned, if when you are closing out this webinar and you do not receive the survey will also be sent in a follow-up email, and that is where you can opt in to those additional emails with some materials for you, and you will also be receiving the recording as well as the full presentation in that follow-up email. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.